You know, when I talk with people about providing, the conversation almost always starts with guilt. They feel like they should be doing more. They feel like they're letting someone down. They feel like maybe if they stop providing, everything will fall apart. And over the years, I've mentored leaders, parents, caregivers, and faithful church people who were deeply generous, but also deeply exhausted. Their struggle wasn't a lack of faith or commitment. It was a distorted rhythm of providing that had drifted far from God's heart. One mentee, I'll call him Mark, came to me completely burned out. He was a husband, a dad, a church volunteer, and the primary income earner for his family. And on paper, he was doing everything right. But spiritually, though, he was empty. Mark Mark believed that providing meant never saying no. He worked extra hours, filled every gap at church, and carried the emotional weight of everyone around him. When I asked him when he last rested without guilt, he laughed instead and said, "That doesn't feel biblical." So we started somewhere very simple: actively listen. I didn't fix his schedule or quote verses at him. I listened. As he talked, it became clear that Mark wasn't trying to honor God. He was trying to outrun fear: fear of being seen as lazy, fear of disappointing people, or fear that if he stopped, he'd lose his value. And together, we reframed providing as participating in God's provision, not replacing it. His first step of obedience wasn't giving more, it was resting. And that rest didn't make him less faithful, it made him healthier. Another mentee, Sarah, struggled with the opposite end of the spectrum. She was incredibly generous with her friends, neighbors, and always showing up with meals, childcare, or emotional support. But she never asked for help herself. And when we talked, she admitted something quietly. I don't think I'm allowed to need anything. Sarah had learned to provide as a way to belong. She was useful, if she was useful, she was welcome. And if she wasn't, she felt invisible. Our work together focused on encourage speaking. I challenged her to name her own needs out loud to God and to safe people. And that was terrifying to her. But over time, she began to experience a deeper form of provision: being cared for, not just caring. God's generosity isn't one directional. When we refuse to receive, we unintentionally deny others the chance to live generously as well. One of the most common patterns I see is people confusing faithfulness with overload. A church leader I mentored, his name, call him James, was close to quitting altogether. He loved Jesus, but he resented the church. Every need somehow landed on his plate. Every gap became his responsibility. And as we talked, I asked a hard question: who taught you that God's work depends on you? Well, that question led us to monitor workload. We mapped out what James was carrying versus what he was actually called to carry. And some things required delegation, some required letting go, some required just trusting that God could meet needs without his constant intervention. It reduced his workload. And it didn't weaken the church, it strengthened it. More people stepped into their gifts, shared provision, replaced silent suffering. For many mentees, Give Rest has been the most spiritual and most resisted practice. Rest feels risky when your identity is tied to providing. But Scripture consistently, constantly, always shows that God builds rest into provision. Sabbath wasn't a suggestion, it was protection. One mentee told me, if I rest, I feel like I'm failing. We worked through this together. Rest isn't quitting, it's trusting. It's declaration that God is still God when we stop. And over time, rest didn't make them less generous. It made their generosity joyful again. Not all struggles with providing from burnout. Some actually come with boredom. A mentee named Emily felt disconnected from church and faith. She was helping, but nothing felt meaningful. And as we explored her story, we focused on discover passion. She had gifts that were never being used. She was providing out of obligation, not calling. And when she began serving in ways that aligned with how God wired her, providing actually shifted from draining to life-giving. Boredom wasn't a sign of apathy. It was a signal of misalignment. Finally, we worked toward allow engagement. God's design for provision is communal. No one is meant to carry everything alone. When people engage together, listening, giving, resting, serving, provision becomes sustainable. The most powerful shift I've seen in mentees isn't learning to give more, it's learning to give with others. If providing feels heavy right now, that doesn't mean you're failing. It may mean your rhythm is just a little out of sync with God's heart. God is generous by nature. He provides even before we ask. He invites us to join him, not replace him. And when we learn to provide from rest, trust, and community, generosity stops costing us our soul. Providing, practiced God's way, doesn't drain life. It multiplies it. And that's the rhythm we're learning to rediscover together.